Hello, my name is Susan Lambert. I'm the Vice President of Core Knowledge Language Arts here at Amplify. Thank you so much for being willing to participate in the focus groups, and I'm looking forward to meeting each one of you. Also, thank you very much for watching this webinar to orient you to the Core Knowledge Language Arts program. I just wanted to take a little bit of time to help you understand what you're going to be seeing and reviewing so that we can best get your feedback. Again, I'm very anxious to meet you, looking forward to it very much. CKLA, or Core Knowledge Language Arts, is a very unique ELA program. It's unique in the sense that we bring the world to kids. As a former educator myself, I always believed that it was my job to provide my students with as much information and knowledge about the world as possible. We know that many students don't get outside their 6-block radius of their own home, much less get outside of their city or their state. And so because of that, we really believe that it's our job as educators to. So at CKLA, this program really allows teachers to translate that research into real practice. And what do I mean by research? Well, we know that for students to be fully proficient in reading, they have to have background knowledge and they have to have vocabulary. So CKLA does that. It puts knowledge at the center of everything we do. It is an innovative, fully integrated English language arts program that uses reading, writing, speaking, and listening with unique components that really work together to enhance each other. We know from cognitive research that the reading gap that we experience across the country, particularly in grades 3 and grades 4, is really about the knowledge gap. Again, students have to have background knowledge and vocabulary in order to understand what they're reading. So CKLA does that, right? We'll talk a little bit about foundational skills. We teach kids foundational skills. We also teach them comprehension, but we do that in a really unique way where we bring to students coherence within the building of background or content knowledge in some really rich domains of information. One of the key distinguishers of CKLA from other programs is this idea of building knowledge within grades and across grades. Really quickly, this idea explained in kindergarten, you can see here the domains of instruction from nursery rhymes and fables to the 5 senses, stories, plants, farms. How does this work? Well, when we're teaching a unit on plants, you can imagine we're going to be using vocabulary like stems and leaves and soil and water. And we'll do a series of read-alouds 2 to 3 weeks with the kids, embedding them in this knowledge domain. And as we continue to use this vocabulary through read-alouds from one day to the next day to the next day, they start to grow in both their background knowledge, their domain vocabulary, and their academic vocabulary. Then if you can imagine, then we're going to extend their learning by then taking them from the unit of or domain of plants into our unit or domain on farms. Again, extending their background knowledge, putting this idea of plants in a different context where they're going to develop even more vocabulary. So you can see as we sort of go on and on through the development of these domains, a semantic map will be built, if you will, around the vocabulary and around the background knowledge. Similarly, knowledge builds across the grade levels in this program. So in kindergarten, we're introducing students to a unit or domain all about stories. We will extend their knowledge in first grade to include fables and stories, further extending in grade 2, grade 3, grade 4, grade 5, where we actually do some personal narrative units. And you can see the same thing happens when we do that through the science thread. So really the knowledge that we're building within each grade level and across the grade levels are all about literature topics and social studies topic and science topics, all those things that kids are really engaged and motivated in. So again, referring to this idea that over time we're building and integrating strategies together to produce very effective, efficient readers. Let's just quickly talk about how each of the strands work. Again, in K2, the skills strand is all about teaching kids to learn to read and learn to write. This is systematic phonics, along with handwriting, grammar, language conventions, spelling, and writing in each of the text types. Again, about 60 minutes of instruction. The knowledge strand, this is, again, 60 minutes of instruction where we're using the reading process to learn and the writing process to learn. So this is domains of information that last about 2 to 3 weeks. They're interactive oral read-alouds, helping to model close reading strategies, embedding kids in text-based discussions, developing their vocabulary, both academic and domain, and then we also have application activities, so they're not just doing 60 minutes of read aloud. Again, in grades 3, 4, and 5, that comes together in just one strand of integrated instruction, where we continue examining complex text through close reading activities, again, continuing to integrate this idea of speaking and listening through collaborative conversations, writing in response to literature, writing in all of the text types, using that vocabulary, making the switch from systematic phonics to now morphology and word structure while continuing to develop in grammar, usage, and mechanics. Again, this is comprehensive ELA. And all of the areas of reading, writing, speaking, viewing, listening are all included in this program. Let's just take a few minutes to do a deep dive inside a classroom. What would it look like in Skills Strand, Grade 1, Unit 2? So as a teacher, I'm going to pick up my teacher guide, which you'll have for each of the units in each of the grade levels. And the very first thing is I'm going to go to my table of contents to just sort of see how the instruction develops throughout the table of contents. I noticed that in Lesson 1, which is this first lesson that we're going to go through, is we are actually doing a basic code lesson. So we're going to be introducing students to the sound spelling pattern E, or double E. The very first thing I'm going to do is notice that, oh, I see by the end of today's lesson, these are the things that students are going to know and be able to do. They're going to be able to read some one-syllable words. They're going to listen to and orally produce this sound, both in the beginning, middle, and end of words. Students are going to read and write one-syllable words, and in reading, we're going to be doing the story Grand Trips, where students are going to identify features of sentences and ask questions. I also can see that in today's lesson, I have 2 formative assessment opportunities that actually relate to the primary focus of my lesson. We're going to be doing some discussion questions, and I'm going to be doing an observational assessment with that. And then I see I have an activity page that students are going to individually respond to some story questions. In each of the lessons, and particularly for this lesson, I see I have 2 very specific lesson segments. My first lesson segment is we're going to be working on foundational skills, and I can see we're going to be doing some code flipbook review for about 10 minutes. We're going to introduce some sounds, about 5 minutes worth. We're going to introduce the spelling, the sound first, then the spelling, and then we're going to be doing some practice. I can see I have a combination of both whole group and small group instruction. And then we're going to be doing a reading segment where we're going to introduce this reader because it's the first lesson of this unit. We're going to introduce a brand new reader, and I'm going to do some demonstration with a big book. So again, going to be doing some warm-up with the students, and I'm going to be using my code flipbook to do that warm-up or review. And then I'm going to be introducing the new sound and modeling that new sound for students. And then we're going to be doing some work again with introducing the spelling. So first introducing the sound and then introducing how to represent that spelling. I'm going to be using my vowel code flipbook. I also have one for consonants, but today I'm going to do that with vowels. We're going to be focusing on this particular page in the flipbook, which is all about the sound spelling pattern represented here. And I'm also going to be using my sound spelling cards, reminding students of the power bar, or that little bar underneath the EE, reminding them that this is actually not the most frequent sound spelling. A lot of other sound spellings are more frequent with this. And students learned that this power bar, the longer it is, the more frequent that sound spelling pattern. Students are going to be interacting with their individual code charts, where they will go to the row with the EE, and they're going to take their green marker and they're going to outline this sound spelling pattern to know that they have already been instructed on this. Again, you can see on this chart that we introduce these sound spelling patterns along with that power bar, so students understand how frequently that particular sound spelling pattern is used. Again, just moving on in the foundational skills segment, I'm actually going to be doing some practice with this sound with my students in small groups, and some groups are going to be working with a partner or individually. We're going to be practicing both our handwriting and understanding how to represent the sound spelling pattern. And this is the foundations as well of beginning spelling. So we're going to be practicing some words with this sound spelling pattern. And then we're going to be further practicing and identifying words with their pictures. Next, I'm going to move into my reading segment. And because this is the first time we've used this particular reader, I'm going to actually introduce my students to this reader. And we're going to do a couple things with that. First of all, we're going to look at the table of contents, and we're going to talk about or make predictions about what each of these stories are, maybe what this reader is going to be about. And students will come to find out that this reader is all about Gran, and Gran travels all over the world and comes back and tells her grandchildren the stories and adventures. We're going to do a shared reading with the big book on the very first story called Gran's Trips. And during this shared reading, the teacher's guide will help me understand how I'm going to interact, have my students interact with this model lesson using our big book. After we're done reading Gran's Trip, we're going to have some discussion questions, and you'll notice here that there are mostly literal questions, an evaluative question. Again, I understand as a teacher, these questions are there to help guide the discussion with the students. I may or may not use all of these discussion questions just based on the needs of my classroom. And I also see that my check for understanding here is this observational assessment, where I am going to use these discussion questions as a way to determine how well some of my students or most of my students have comprehended the story. The next thing we're going to do is the kids are actually going to go to their own reader. So each student has an individual copy of the reader. We're going to pick that reader up and go to our activity book. And in our activity book, we're actually going to go back into the text and find evidence of the text that we're going to record here. Again, I understand that these activity pages are really going to be my way to formatively assess how my students are doing in terms of progress on this particular outcome. And then at the end of this particular lesson, students are going to be receiving a take-home. This take-home will tell family members that they have just been introduced to a brand new reader, and they're going to get some activities here that they can do with their children at home. And so this activity page I'll be sure to send home with my students at the end of the lesson. The second part of the ELA block, which could be done with a break in between, I'm going to let my students have a little bit of a break, and then we're going to come back and we're actually going to do about 60 minutes in the knowledge strand. Today we're going to be going through in grade 1 domain 2, which is a human body. Again, I have my own teacher guide for this particular strand, so a different teacher guide from the skills strand. And I'm going to look at my table of contents and see through my table of contents what we are going to be doing within this particular domain or unit. Since this is the first day that I'm going to be introducing this, I'm going to look at the primary focus of my objectives for this lesson, and I notice that we've got speaking and listening, we've got reading, we've got language objectives, and we've got writing objectives. I also know that I have a formative assessment opportunity for students within this particular lesson. Again, the primary focus of this particular lesson is students will review what they know about their bodies. Students are going to explain the human body as a network of systems. We're going to be doing some work on the Tier 2 word systems, the Tier 3 word organs, and we're going to be starting to draft together a topic sentence. And I note that it says with assistance. I'm going to take a peek at my lesson at a glance chart and see that I'm going to introduce this read aloud. We're going to then read the read aloud and do some discussion questions with that, and then do an application segment. In introducing the read aloud, this helps me contextualize the students, particularly for this first lesson, in terms of what do you already know about the human body and what do you think we're going to learn about the human body. So I'm actually going to develop a KWL for them today, and this chart will follow us through this particular unit. So I'm going to start reading my read aloud, and my read aloud text is all right here for me in the teacher guide. As well as places that I can start or that I can stop in the read aloud and really engage my students in an interactive dialogue. At the same time I'm reading, I'm also going to be displaying some images. So my students aren't holding text in their hands, rather they're gathered around me. I'm reading this read aloud to them and referring to the images so we can start to tap into listening comprehension and use the images then to support that listening comprehension. So I'm going to continue my read aloud with lots and lots of images that come within each read aloud. If my students need extra support, there's support there for me to prompt in case we just want to make sure students are getting the gist or the essence of this read aloud. When I'm done reading the read aloud, I'm going to go through some of these discussion questions. And again, they're tagged for me so I know if it's a literal question, if it's an inferential question. I'm going to stop and do a quick check for understanding through a think, pair, share today. And then we're going to work on some word work, just a really explicit, very short 5-minute interactive vocabulary exercise. And then we're going to move to our application section where we're going to be doing a couple things. Today we're going to be working on multiple meaning words, and so we're going to look at a poster and talk about the word organ and understand sometimes the word organ can mean a musical instrument and sometimes the word organ can mean something within our bodies. After that, we're going to work together to develop a topic sentence that we're going to start building a writing activity throughout this particular unit. And at the end, students are going to be given a very small exit pass that we're going to help them identify sort of the main idea that we've talked about in this particular lesson. Again, with the other take-home material from the skills strand, I'm going to also send home this take-home for family members. And this does a really good job of helping families understand what we're going to be studying over the course of the next couple of weeks, some words that they can use at home to help reinforce the topic of this particular unit, and some additional resources, books they could look at in the library, or some other resources that they can go to on the internet. Moving to grade 4, and just a reminder, we've gone now from 2 strands where we had the skills strand and the knowledge strand in 2 discrete instructional blocks to 1 integrated strand of about 90 minutes. So let's take a peek inside grade 4 unit 2 and see what's happening within this unit. Again, as a teacher, I'm going to go to my table of contents and take a peek at the kind of topics and instruction we're going to be doing both in the blocks within the lesson and overall within the unit. My students are going to be using a reader and an activity book. So just like in K2, each student gets a reader for each unit, and the topic we're going to be focusing on in this unit is empires in the Middle Ages. So I'll make sure my students have both their reader and their activity book for this particular unit as we start Lesson 2. Lesson 1, which we did yesterday, was a core connections lesson, and a core connections lesson actually helps students understand what did they previously learn in instruction, and what are we going to be learning in this particular unit. So in Lesson 2, I can see I've got several primary focus for this lesson. So we're going to be focusing in reading, in grammar, in morphology, and in writing. And I also can see that we're going to have several activity pages for this lesson, all that I can use as formative assessment opportunities within this particular lesson. Looking at the lesson at a glance chart, I'll see that I'm going to spend about 45 minutes in my reading segment today, about 30 minutes with my language segment, which is going to include both grammar and morphology, and about 15 minutes of writing. And I'm going to introduce students, because this is the beginning of the unit, with a graphic organizer, and we're going to do some practice taking notes, because by the end of this unit, we're actually going to develop a persuasive piece based on the content of this particular unit. So in my writing segment, we're actually going to introduce the chapter, introduce the reader. Again, we're going to orient students to the reader and sort of the information that we're going to be learning in this particular reader. And then today's reading is a whole group, but I'm going to ask the students to do some individual reading. So I'm going to ask students to individually read the page, and then we're going to come together in a discussion. And for this particular lesson, we're going to continue in that manner, where I'm going to ask them to read to find out some information, have them read that independently, and then come back and we're going to talk about it as a whole group. And of course, I know that I can be flexible in terms of the reading instruction. It just happens to be that this particular lesson, because it's one of the first lessons of the unit, we want to make sure students actually get a good, strong foundation start. After this reading segment, we're going to go back and do some checks for understanding to ensure that the comprehension, we've actually been successful in that. And I can see here that I have various questions that I can use. Again, don't have to use them all, but based on where my students are and how I'm seeing and feeling about their comprehension, I can pick and choose those that are most important. My students are also going to get a take-home page that's related to this story. So an excerpt of their reading will go home as a take-home page. And I'm going to ask them at home to read this to a caregiver or to somebody at home, and then ask them to respond in some way and bring that back the next day. For our language segment, again, we're going to be focusing on both grammar and morphology. And so we're going to be doing some work with nouns and adjectives in this particular segment. And I'm going to give them some practice with those nouns and adjectives. Again, a formative assessment opportunity to see if they're understanding. We're going to move to also do some morphology for about 15 minutes in this lesson. And again, we're working on prefixes and the meanings of prefixes on and not. Again, another formative assessment opportunity through an activity page. And then in today's lesson, the very last segment is all about taking notes. And so I'm going to model for my students some expectations about note-taking, and we're actually going to work through a graphic organizer together. And we're going to be having them record information here that they found. And we're going to keep this graphic organizer and use it in several lessons, and then again be using this as we start to write a persuasive essay. So thank you very much for taking the time, this 25 minutes, to listen to an orientation and a little bit of a day in the life of students in both grades 1 and grade 4. We would like you to take a really brief survey as we're looking for your thoughts. Click on the link in the email and it will take you to that survey. And then lastly, we would invite you to explore our digital resource site where you can explore all of the program, kindergarten through grade 5. You can see each one of the units, the materials that are associated with the units, the kind of instruction students will be exposed to, and the kind of learning that develops for the students both within a grade and across grades. And again, in your email, you will have a PDF that will give you some information about how to access that resource site. Thank you again. Looking forward very much to meeting you coming up very soon here and hearing your thoughts about CKLA.